CO's sports car hits Latino cyclist. Dashcam footage exposes dark corporate secret. Hello? Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. He was just a hard-working man riding his bike like every other day, trying to provide for his family. But in one heart-stopping moment, everything changed. A luxurious sports car came out of nowhere, crashing into him, leaving him on the ground, broken and helpless. Behind the wheel, a powerful CEO who had everything to lose, and a split-second decision that would unravel secrets darker than anyone could imagine. What happens next will test the limits of justice, sacrifice, and forgiveness. The truth hidden in the shadows of that accident is far more than anyone could ever prepare for, and once it's uncovered, nothing will ever be the same. The bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles were already alive with the morning rush as the sun began to climb over the city skyline. Amidst the sea of sleek sedans and honking taxis, a lone figure on a battered bicycle wove his way through traffic with practiced ease. This was Miguel Ramirez, a 34-year-old Latino delivery rider, his weathered face a canvas of determination and weariness. Miguel had left his small apartment in East LA before dawn, kissing his sleeping wife Lucia and their 5-year-old son Diego goodbye. As he pedaled, he couldn't shake the image of Diego's hopeful eyes from the night before. "Papi, can we go to Disneyland someday?" The question had pierced Miguel's heart. He had forced a smile and promised, "Someday, mijo." But the truth was, they could barely afford rent, let alone a day at the happiest place on earth. With each rotation of his bicycle wheels, Miguel's mind raced faster than his legs. Bills piled up at home, Lucia's hours at the diner had been cut, and the cost of Diego's asthma medication kept rising. The weight of his family's dreams and struggles pressed down on him, heavier than any package he'd ever delivered. As Miguel approached a busy intersection on Wilshire Boulevard, the light turned yellow. He increased his speed, determined to make it through. The deliveries wouldn't wait, and neither would his family's needs. Just as he entered the crosswalk, the light flashed red. In that same moment, a gleaming silver Porsche 911 GT3 RS, worth more than Miguel would make in a decade, came barreling down the street. Behind the wheel sat Richard Blake, the 45-year-old CEO of Tech Fusion, one of Silicon Valley's hottest startups. His perfectly tailored suit and carefully styled salt and pepper hair exuded success and power. But Richard's eyes weren't on the road. They were fixed on his smartphone, scanning an urgent email about a potential investor pulling out. The stress of maintaining his company's meteoric rise had become all-consuming. He had long ago stopped seeing the world around him, focused solely on the next deal, the next quarter's earnings. Time seemed to slow as Miguel turned his head, eyes widening in horror at the approaching sports car. Richard looked up a split second too late, his foot slamming on the brake pedal with crushing force. But physics and fate had already conspired against them both. The impact was sickening. Miguel's body flew through the air like a rag doll, his bike crumpling beneath the Porsche's front bumper. He hit the pavement with a dull thud that echoed through the suddenly silent street. Blood began to pool around his motionless form, a stark contrast to the sun-baked asphalt. Richard sat frozen behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The world around him blurred, replaced by a roaring in his ears. Slowly, as if moving through molasses, he opened the car door and stepped out. The scene that greeted him was like something out of a nightmare. Bystanders had already begun to gather, their shocked faces a mirror of his own internal horror. Someone was shouting for an ambulance. A woman knelt beside Miguel, desperately checking for signs of life. Richard's gaze locked onto Miguel's face. The delivery rider's eyes were open, filled with pain and a desperate plea. In that moment, their worlds collided in more ways than one. Richard saw not just a victim of his distraction, but a man, a father, a husband, someone with hopes and dreams now lying shattered on the unforgiving street. The weight of what he had done crashed down on Richard like a physical force. His carefully constructed world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless in the face of this stark human tragedy. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. With trembling hands, he pulled it out to see a message from his personal lawyer. "Whatever happened, say nothing. I'm on my way." The cold, calculating part of Richard's brain, the part that had propelled him to the top of the corporate world, began to whir into action. He looked around, suddenly aware of the smartphones pointed in his direction, capturing every moment of this unfolding disaster. But it was the Dashcam, the tiny camera mounted on his windshield that had recorded everything: his distraction, the impact, the aftermath. In that device lay the power to destroy everything he had built. Richard's finger hovered over the phone's screen, torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the crushing weight of guilt. Miguel's labored breathing seemed to fill the air, a constant reminder of the life hanging in the balance. In that moment, as the first police car rounded the corner, Richard Blake made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. He pressed delete on the Dashcam app, erasing the previous hour of footage. As he stepped back from his car, hands raised in a gesture of surrender to the approaching officers, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had just sealed both their fates. Miguel's broken body lay just feet away, a stark reminder of the human cost of ambition and distraction. The morning sun continued to climb over Los Angeles, indifferent to the drama unfolding on its streets. For Miguel Ramirez and Richard Blake, two men from vastly different worlds, this was the moment everything changed. Their stories, now inextricably linked, were just beginning. A tale of guilt, justice, and the unexpected connections that can alter the course of lives forever. The harsh fluorescent lights of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center cast an unforgiving glow on Miguel's bruised and battered form. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring his fragile hold on life. The once vibrant delivery rider now lay still, a maze of tubes and wires connecting him to the devices keeping him alive. Lucia Ramirez burst through the ICU doors, her dark eyes wide with panic. "Mi amor," she cried, rushing to Miguel's bedside. Her trembling hands hovered over his body, afraid to touch him for fear of causing more pain. Behind her, little Diego clutched his abuela's hand, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. "Señora Ramirez?" A tall, silver-haired doctor approached, his face grave. "I'm Dr. Thompson. Your husband's condition is critical. The impact caused severe internal bleeding and spinal damage. We've managed to stabilize him, but..." Lucia's world tilted as Dr. Thompson's words washed over her. Phrases like possible paralysis and long-term rehabilitation pierced through her shock. She sank into a nearby chair, her legs no longer able to support her. Will my papi be okay?" Diego's small voice quivered as he looked up at the doctor. Dr. Thompson knelt down, his eyes softening. "We're doing everything we can, little man. Your dad is very strong." As the gravity of their situation sank in, Lucia's mind raced. How would they pay for this? Their meager savings wouldn't cover even a fraction of the mounting medical bills. And if Miguel couldn't work... She pushed the thought away, focusing on her husband's battered face. "Lucha, mi amor," she whispered, finally taking his hand. "Fight for us." Across town, in a sleek penthouse overlooking the city, Richard Blake paced like a caged animal. His usual confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a man haunted by his actions. "Richard, you need to calm down," Elizabeth Cho, TechFusion's lead counsel, said firmly. "We've got this under control." Richard whirled on her, his eyes wild. "Under control? I nearly killed a man, Liz. His family." "Is not your concern right now," Elizabeth cut him off. "What matters is protecting you and the company. The Dashcam footage is gone. There were no reliable witnesses. As far as anyone knows, it was just an unfortunate accident." Richard's stomach churned at her cold logic. He walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, a family's life was in shambles because of him. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, threatening to suffocate him. His phone buzzed, another message from the board of directors demanding an update. Richard's finger hovered over the screen, the urge to confess everything almost overwhelming. But Elizabeth's voice cut through his thoughts. "Don't even think about it," she warned. "One wrong move and everything you've built comes crashing down. Think of your employees, your shareholders. You have a responsibility to them." Richard's hand fell to his side, the phone suddenly feeling like it weighed a ton. He turned back to Elizabeth, his voice hollow. "What's our next move?" As Elizabeth laid out their strategy, a carefully crafted statement, a generous but anonymous donation to the hospital, Richard felt a piece of his soul wither. He had always prided himself on his integrity, on building a company that stood for something more than just profit. Now he was hiding behind lawyers and PR spin. The sun began to rise over Los Angeles, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. In the hospital, Lucia dozed fitfully in an uncomfortable chair, her hand still clutching Miguel's. In his penthouse, Richard stared at his reflection in the window, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. Two worlds, forever changed by a moment's distraction. As the city below began to stir, neither Lucia nor Richard could shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey, one that would test the limits of love, justice, and redemption. The beeping of Miguel's heart monitor echoed through the quiet hospital room, a steady reminder of the fragile line between life and death. And in that rhythmic sound lay the seeds of a story that would shake the foundations of power and privilege in ways no one could yet imagine. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated Richard Blake's haggard face as he sat alone in his home office. The plush leather chair that had once felt like a throne now seemed to swallow him whole. Outside, the twinkling lights of Los Angeles stretched to the horizon, a stark contrast to the darkness consuming his soul. With trembling hands, he reached for the laptop before him. For days he had avoided this moment, but the weight of his conscience had become unbearable. He needed to know the truth, to see with his own eyes what had really happened that fateful morning. Richard's finger hovered over the touchpad, his heart pounding in his chest. With a deep breath, he clicked on the folder containing the recovered dashcam footage. The video began to play, and Richard felt his world tilt on its axis. There he was, driving down Wilshire Boulevard, his eyes glued to his phone. He watched in horror as his car plowed into Miguel, the sickening impact playing out in high definition. Richard's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep watching. As the video continued, Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. The timestamp showed that the camera had been recording for nearly an hour before the accident. Curious, he scrolled back, and what he heard next made his blood run cold. "And that's how we'll hide the undocumented workers' wages," came the voice of Jack Donovan, Tech Fusion's CFO. "The shell companies are all set up. These immigrants will never know they're being cheated." "Brilliant, Jack," responded Sarah Chen, the COO. "With this scheme, we'll boost profits by at least 15% this quarter. The board will be thrilled." Richard sat back, stunned. His top executives were discussing a massive fraud scheme, one that exploited the very people like Miguel, hardworking immigrants just trying to make a living. The irony was almost too much to bear. As the full implications of what he had discovered sank in, Richard felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. This wasn't just about the accident anymore. He now held evidence of corporate corruption that could bring down the entire company he had built from the ground up. The weight of this new secret pressed down on him, adding to the already crushing burden of guilt he carried. Richard's mind raced with the potential consequences. If he came forward with this information, it wouldn't just be his own reputation and freedom at stake. Hundreds of employees would lose their jobs, investors would be ruined, and the ripple effects would be devastating. But if he stayed silent, he would be complicit in the exploitation of vulnerable workers. People like Miguel, who risked everything just to provide for their families, would continue to be cheated and abused. Richard's gaze fell on a framed photo on his desk, himself shaking hands with the governor at a charity gala. He had always seen himself as one of the good guys in the cutthroat world of tech. Now that image felt like a lie. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone. He needed to talk to someone, to confess, to find a way out of this moral quagmire. But as his finger hovered over his lawyer's number, he hesitated. Who could he trust with this information? The soft ping of an incoming email drew his attention back to the laptop. It was a news alert. A local TV station was running a story on the hit-and-run accident involving a prominent tech CEO. Richard's heart rate spiked as he clicked on the link. The report showed grainy security camera footage from a nearby building. While it didn't clearly show the accident, it did capture Richard's distinctive Porsche speeding away from the scene. The reporter's voice droned on about unnamed sources and ongoing investigations. Richard slumped in his chair, feeling the walls closing in. He now faced an impossible choice: come clean about everything, the accident, the fraud, all of it, or continue down this path of deception, hoping to salvage what was left of his life and career. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Richard Blake sat alone in his office, a man trapped between two worlds. The dashcam footage played on a loop on his laptop, a constant reminder of the moment everything changed. In a hospital across town, Miguel Ramirez fought for his life, unaware of the storm brewing around him. His family's struggle for justice was about to collide with a web of corporate greed and deceit, setting the stage for a battle that would test the limits of morality, redemption, and the American dream itself. The city of Los Angeles stirred to life, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the shadows of its gleaming skyscrapers. But soon, the truth would come to light, and no one, from the boardrooms to the barrios, would be left untouched by its revelations. The steady beep of the heart monitor had become a haunting melody for Lucia Ramirez. She sat vigil by Miguel's bedside, her once vibrant eyes now dulled by exhaustion and worry. It had been 2 weeks since the accident, and while Miguel had stabilized, he remained in a coma, his future uncertain. Dr. Thompson entered the room, his face a mask of professional concern. "Mrs. Ramirez, we need to talk about Miguel's prognosis." Lucia's heart clenched. She steeled herself for what was to come, gripping Miguel's unresponsive hand tightly. "The swelling in Miguel's spine has gone down, but—" Dr. Thompson paused, choosing his words carefully. "The damage is extensive. Even if he wakes up, there's a high probability he may never walk again." The words hit Lucia like a physical blow. She struggled to breathe, her mind reeling. "But there's a chance, right?" she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He could recover?" Dr. Thompson's eyes softened with compassion. "We never say never in medicine, Mrs. Ramirez, but you need to be prepared for the possibility of long-term disability." As the doctor continued to explain potential treatments and rehabilitation options, Lucia's thoughts drifted to their small apartment, to Diego waiting at home with his grandmother. How would they survive if Miguel couldn't work? How would they afford the mounting medical bills, let alone the cost of long-term care? "Mrs. Ramirez?" Dr. Thompson's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "I know this is overwhelming. We have a social worker who can discuss assistance programs with you." Lucia nodded numbly, her eyes fixed on Miguel's still form. As Dr. Thompson left, she leaned in close to her husband's ear. "Mi amor, you have to fight," she whispered fiercely. "We need you. Please come back to us." Across town in the gleaming offices of Tech Fusion, Richard Blake sat through another tense board meeting. The accident and subsequent media attention had spooked investors, and the company's stock price was taking a hit. "We need to get ahead of this narrative," Jack Donovan, the CFO, insisted. "A few well-placed donations, maybe a press conference about road safety." Richard barely heard him. His mind was consumed by the weight of his secrets, the hit and run, the fraud scheme he had uncovered. Each day, the gnawing doubt and guilt threatened to overwhelm him. As the meeting droned on, Richard's gaze drifted to the window. From this height, the city seemed peaceful, orderly. But he knew the truth that lay beneath the surface, the struggle, the injustice, the lives hanging in the balance. "Richard?" Sarah Chen's sharp voice snapped him back to attention. "Are you with us? We need to make a decision on this PR strategy." He looked around the table at the expectant faces of his executive team. These were people he had once trusted implicitly. Now he saw them through new eyes, wondering who else knew about the fraud, who else was complicit in exploiting vulnerable workers. I need some time to think," Richard stammered, rising abruptly from his chair. "We'll reconvene tomorrow." Ignoring the confused and concerned looks, he strode out of the conference room. His feet carried him to the elevator, down to the parking garage, and into his car almost on autopilot. Before he knew it, Richard found himself parked across the street from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He sat there, engine idling, staring at the entrance. Somewhere in that building was Miguel Ramirez, the man whose life he had shattered. The urge to go in, to confess everything, was almost overwhelming. But fear held him back. Fear of losing everything, of facing the consequences of his actions. As he watched, a young Latino woman emerged from the hospital doors. Even from a distance, Richard could see the weight of worry and exhaustion in her posture. With a start, he realized this must be Miguel's wife. Lucia Ramirez walked to the bus stop, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She had no idea how they would manage, but she knew she had to be strong for Miguel and Diego. As she waited for the bus, she closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer for a miracle. Unknown to Lucia, that miracle might be sitting in a luxury car just across the street, wrestling with a moral dilemma that would shape both their futures. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was at a crossroads, and he knew that whatever choice he made next would set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. As the Los Angeles sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, two souls grappled with uncertainty and fear. Lucia, fighting for her family's survival, and Richard, torn between self-preservation and the pull of his conscience. The truth lay just beneath the surface, waiting to burst forth and change everything. But who would have the courage to bring it to light? The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor assaulted Richard's senses as he cautiously made his way towards the ICU. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Dressed in plain clothes, jeans, and a nondescript hoodie, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, he was a far cry from the polished CEO the world knew. Richard had agonized over this decision for days. The need to see Miguel, to confront the reality of what he'd done, had become an obsession. As he approached Miguel's room, he hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. Inside, the steady beep of machines filled the air. Miguel lay motionless, a maze of tubes and wires connecting him to various monitors. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Seeing Miguel like this, pale, vulnerable, fighting for his life, made the consequences of his actions viscerally real. He approached the bed slowly, as if in a trance. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." Suddenly, voices in the hallway jolted Richard back to reality. He quickly moved to the corner of the room, pretending to study a chart on the wall as Lucia entered, accompanied by a doctor. "Mrs. Ramirez," the doctor was saying. "Miguel's latest scans show some improvement in brain activity. It's a positive sign, but I don't want to give you false hope. The road ahead is still long and uncertain." Lucia nodded, her eyes never leaving her husband's face. "Gracias, doctor. We'll keep praying for a miracle." As the doctor left, Lucia sank into the chair beside Miguel's bed, taking his hand in hers. "Mi amor," she said softly, "you need to wake up. Diego asks about you every day. He made this for you in school." She placed a colorful drawing on the bedside table, a stick-figure family holding hands with "Get well soon, Papi," scrawled across the top in a child's handwriting. Richard watched, rooted to the spot, as Lucia continued to talk to Miguel. She spoke of their son's latest adventures at school, of the neighbors who had been helping with meals, of her own determination to keep their little family afloat. "I don't know how we'll manage, Miguel," she admitted, her voice breaking. "The hospital bills keep coming. I'm picking up extra shifts at the diner, but it's not enough. And if you can't..." She trailed off, unable to voice the fear of Miguel's potential disability. The raw emotion in Lucia's voice cut through Richard like a knife. He had known intellectually that his actions had consequences, but witnessing this intimate moment, the love, the fear, the struggle, brought home the full weight of what he'd done. As Lucia continued to speak softly to Miguel, sharing hopes and fears in rapid Spanish, Richard felt like an intruder in a sacred space. He edged towards the door, desperate to escape the suffocating guilt. Just as he reached for the handle, Lucia looked up. Their eyes met for a brief electric moment. Richard saw confusion flash across her face, quickly followed by a spark of recognition. "Wait," Lucia called out as Richard yanked the door open. "Do I know you?" But Richard was already gone, hurrying down the corridor with his head down. His heart raced as he made his way out of the hospital and into the warm California evening. Back in his car, Richard sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by what he'd witnessed. The image of Lucia holding Miguel's hand, of the child's drawing, of the machines keeping a man alive. It all swirled in his mind, impossible to ignore. For the first time since the accident, Richard allowed himself to truly feel the enormity of his actions. Not just the physical harm he'd caused, but the ripple effects on this family's entire life. Their struggles, their fears, their uncertain future. All of it lay at his feet. As he started the engine, Richard knew he could never go back to the person he was before. The carefully constructed walls of denial and self-preservation were crumbling. But what would emerge from the rubble? Would he find the courage to do the right thing, even if it meant losing everything he'd built? The Los Angeles skyline glittered in the distance as Richard drove home, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. Unbeknownst to him, back in the hospital room, Lucia sat puzzling over the familiar-looking stranger, a seed of suspicion taking root in her mind. The paths of these two families, so different yet now inextricably linked, were about to converge in ways neither could imagine. As night fell over the city, the stage was set for revelations that would shake both their worlds to the core. The flickering glow of a laptop screen illuminated Lucia's determined face as she hunched over the kitchen table, long after Diego had been tucked into bed. For weeks, she had scoured the internet, piecing together fragments of information about the accident that had shattered her family's life. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a mix of desperation and newfound purpose. The mysterious man in Miguel's hospital room had reignited her search for justice. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him before, in a context she couldn't quite place. Suddenly, her breath caught in her throat. There, on a local news website's archived footage, was a face she recognized, the man from the hospital, but clean-shaven and impeccably dressed. The caption read, "Tech Fusion CEO Richard Blake at Charity Gala." Lucia's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The expensive car that had hit Miguel, the hushed-up investigation, the familiar stranger by her husband's bedside, it all pointed to one devastating conclusion. Across town in his penthouse office, Richard Blake stared at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. The document before him was blank, but the weight of the words he needed to write pressed down on him like a physical force. His finger hovered over the send button on an email to his board of directors. The subject line read, "Urgent, full disclosure of company violations." Attached was a video file, the recovered dashcam footage that would expose both his hit-and-run and the corporate fraud scheme. Richard's mind raced through the consequences of his actions. Sending this email would likely mean the end of his career, possible jail time, and the collapse of the company he'd built from the ground up. Hundreds of employees would lose their jobs. His reputation would be in tatters. But as he closed his eyes, all he could see was Miguel's still form in the hospital bed, Lucia's tired eyes, and the child's drawing on the bedside table. The weight of his secrets had become unbearable. Just as Richard's finger descended towards the mouse, a sharp knock at his office door made him jump. "Richard!" It was Jack Donovan, his CFO, voice urgent. "We've got a situation. There's a woman downstairs demanding to see you. Says her name is Lucia Ramirez." Richard's blood ran cold. How had she found him? What did she know? Downstairs in the Tech Fusion lobby, Lucia stood her ground, clutching a folder of printouts in barely contained fury. Security guards hovered nearby, unsure how to handle this unexpected situation. "I'm not leaving until I speak to Richard Blake," Lucia insisted, her voice carrying across the polished marble floor. "He knows what he did to my husband, to my family." The elevator dinged and Richard stepped out, flanked by Jack and Sarah Chen, his COO. The moment Lucia's eyes locked onto his, the world seemed to stand still. "You," Lucia breathed, her voice a mix of pain and rage. "It was you." Richard swallowed hard, acutely aware of the curious stares from employees gathered around the edges of the lobby. This was the moment of truth, the convergence of all his fears and guilt. "Mrs. Ramirez," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "I think we should talk in private." "No," Lucia shot back. "No more secrets, no more hiding." She thrust the folder toward him. "I know it was your car that hit Miguel. I have proof, and I won't stop until everyone knows the truth." Jack stepped forward, his face a mask of professional concern. Ma'am, these are serious allegations. I suggest we all calm down and— Enough, Jack, Richard interrupted, raising a hand. The office fell silent, all eyes on their CEO. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his next words. Mrs. Ramirez is right. It's time for the truth. Sarah gasped. Jack's face paled, but Richard kept his eyes locked on Lucia's, seeing in them all the pain and struggle he had caused. I was driving the car that hit your husband, Richard continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed lobby. I was distracted, looking at my phone. And then, I made the worst decision of my life. I left the scene. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Lucia's hands shook, the folder of evidence suddenly unnecessary. But that's not all. Richard pressed on, feeling a strange sense of relief as the words tumbled out. There's more you need to know. About this company, about how we've been operating. As Richard began to detail the fraud scheme, the exploitation of workers like Miguel, Jack lunged forward. Richard, stop, you can't do this. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened and there was no going back. As security guards restrained Jack and employees watched in shocked silence, Richard laid bare the full extent of his sins, personal and professional. Lucia stood rooted to the spot, tears streaming down her face. The truth she had fought so hard to uncover was finally out, but it brought no joy, only a complex tangle of emotions. As Richard finished speaking, the lobby erupted into chaos. Phones were out, recording every moment. Employees whispered frantically to each other. Sarah was already on her phone, desperately trying to reach the company's crisis management team. But for Richard and Lucia, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. In that moment, standing amidst the wreckage of lies and deception, a fragile connection formed, built on shared pain, guilt, and the faintest glimmer of potential redemption. The Los Angeles sun streamed through the lobby's glass walls, casting long shadows across the polished floor. In its unforgiving light, the truth lay exposed, raw and painful. But with that exposure came the first tentative steps towards healing, justice, and the possibility of forgiveness. As sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the approach of a storm that would reshape both their lives, Richard and Lucia stood face to face, united in the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of Richard's confession unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Police swarmed the Tech Fusion lobby, reporters clamored outside, and Richard found himself in an interrogation room, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. Across town, in Miguel's hospital room, Lucia sat by her husband's bedside, her mind reeling from the day's events. The truth she had fought so hard to uncover now felt like a double-edged sword. Justice was within reach, but at what cost? As days turned into weeks, the story dominated headlines. Tech CEO confesses to hit and run, exposes corporate fraud, blared across every news channel. Tech Fusion's stock plummeted, and hundreds of employees faced an uncertain future. Richard, released on bail, retreated to his now empty penthouse. His phone rang incessantly. Lawyers, board members, old friends suddenly turned enemies, but he ignored them all, lost in a haze of regret and self-recrimination. One evening, as the sun set over Los Angeles, casting a golden glow across the city, Richard's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Lucia standing there, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Mrs. Ramirez, he stammered, shocked. Please come in. Lucia stepped inside, taking in the luxurious surroundings with a mixture of awe and resentment. I needed to see you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. To understand. They sat across from each other in Richard's living room, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Miguel woke up, Lucia began, her eyes glistening. The doctors, and they say he might never walk again, but he's alive. He's fighting. Richard's breath caught in his throat. I'm so sorry, he said, the words feeling woefully inadequate. For everything. Lucia nodded, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This arrived today, she said, handing it to Richard. It was a letter from the district attorney's office, outlining the charges against Richard and the potential sentences he faced. The words, 20 years to life, jumped out at him, making his stomach churn. They want me to testify against you, Lucia continued, her voice steady. To ensure you get the maximum sentence. Richard nodded slowly, a strange sense of calm washing over him. I understand. After what I did to your family, you deserve justice. Lucia's eyes flashed. Justice? Is that what this is? She stood up, pacing the room. You know what would be justice? Miguel walking again. Our son not having to grow up without his father. Our lives back the way they were. She turned to face Richard, tears now streaming down her face. But that can't happen. So now I have to decide, do I push for you to spend the rest of your life in prison? Will that fix anything? Richard sat in stunned silence, the full weight of Lucia's dilemma crashing down on him. He realized that his fate now rested in the hands of the woman whose life he had so carelessly upended. What do you want me to do? He asked quietly. Lucia sank back into her chair, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to see you suffer. But another part... She trailed off, shaking her head. The fraud, Richard said suddenly. The workers we exploited, people like Miguel. I have the power to make that right, to ensure they're compensated, to expose the whole system. Lucia looked up, a spark of interest in her eyes. How? I have evidence, names, account numbers. If I cooperate fully with the investigation, we could bring down not just Tech Fusion, but a whole network of companies exploiting immigrant workers. For the first time since entering the apartment, Lucia's expression softened slightly. That could help a lot of families like ours. Richard leaned forward, a desperate hope blooming in his chest. Let me do this. It won't undo what I did to Miguel, but it could be a start. A way to make some kind of amends. Lucia stood up abruptly, moving towards the window. The city sprawled out before her, millions of lights twinkling in the gathering darkness. She thought of Miguel, of Diego, of all the families struggling to make ends meet in a system stacked against them. If I agree to this, she said slowly, if I don't push for the maximum sentence, you have to promise me something. Anything, Richard said, rising to his feet. Lucia turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. You dedicate the rest of your life to this cause, to helping families like ours, to changing the system that allows people like you to exploit people like us. Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders, even as the enormity of the task ahead became clear. I promise, he said solemnly. For as long as I live, I'll work to make this right. Lucia nodded, a complex mix of emotions playing across her face. I'll need time to think, to talk to Miguel, to our families. As she moved towards the door, Richard called out, Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez, for giving me this chance. Lucia paused, her hand on the doorknob. Without turning around, she said softly, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for all the Miguels out there, for all the families who deserve better. With that, she was gone, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his promise and the faintest glimmer of redemption on the horizon. As night fell over Los Angeles, two souls grappled with the complexities of forgiveness, justice, and the long road to healing. The choice Lucia faced would not only determine Richard's fate, but could potentially impact countless lives across the city and beyond. In Miguel's hospital room, in Richard's empty penthouse, and in homes throughout Los Angeles, the ripple effects of one fateful moment continued to spread, reshaping lives and challenging the very foundations of power and privilege in ways no one could have imagined. The Los Angeles County Courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue sky, its stone steps crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. Inside, in a packed courtroom, Richard Blake sat at the defendant's table, his once impeccable suit now rumpled, his face a mask of resigned acceptance. Across the aisle, Lucia Ramirez sat rigidly, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Beside her, in a wheelchair, was Miguel, awake, alert, but forever changed by the accident that had brought them all to this moment. As the judge entered and the room fell silent, the weight of the decision about to be made hung heavy in the air. Richard's fate, and the fate of countless others affected by Tech Fusion's fraudulent practices, rested on what was about to unfold. The prosecutor rose, her voice clear and confident. Your Honor, the people request the maximum sentence. Mr. Blake's actions, both in the hit and run and in orchestrating widespread corporate fraud, demonstrate a callous disregard for human life and dignity. Richard's lawyer countered, emphasizing his client's cooperation with authorities and his efforts to make amends. But as the arguments continued, all eyes turned to Lucia as she was called to make her victim impact statement. Slowly, Lucia stood, her hand lingering on Miguel's shoulder for support. She approached the podium, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Your Honor, when I first learned the truth about what happened to my husband, I was consumed by anger. I wanted vengeance. I wanted Richard Blake to suffer as we had suffered. She paused, her eyes meeting Richard's for a brief moment. But as I've had time to reflect, I've realized something. Locking Mr. Blake away for life won't heal Miguel's injuries. It won't undo the damage done to all the workers exploited by his company. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. What will make a difference, Lucia continued, her voice growing stronger, is using Mr. Blake's knowledge and resources to right these wrongs, to change the system that allows such exploitation to happen. She turned to face Richard directly now. Mr. Blake has promised to dedicate his life to this cause, to helping families like ours and exposing corporate wrongdoing. I believe he should be given that chance. The courtroom erupted in whispers and exclamations. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the room. As Lucia returned to her seat, Miguel reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Their eyes met, a lifetime of love and understanding passing between them in that moment. The judge considered for what seemed like an eternity before finally speaking. Mr. Blake, your actions have caused immeasurable harm. However, I am moved by Mrs. Ramirez's statement and your apparent remorse. He paused, the entire room holding its breath. I hereby sentence you to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years. Additionally, you will be required to work with authorities to fully expose and rectify the fraudulent practices at Tech Fusion and related companies. Upon your release, you will dedicate a minimum of 2,000 hours per year to community service focused on workers' rights and corporate accountability. As the judge's words sank in, a complex mix of emotions washed over the courtroom. Richard bowed his head, tears streaming down his face, not in sorrow for himself, but in awe of the forgiveness he'd been granted and the weight of the task ahead. Lucia and Miguel held each other, their own tears a mixture of relief, lingering pain, and hope for a future where their suffering might prevent others from experiencing the same. As Richard was led away by court officers, he locked eyes with Lucia one last time. No words were needed. The journey of redemption was just beginning, and they both knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Outside the courthouse, as reporters clamored for statements and cameras flashed, a small group of former Tech Fusion workers gathered. They held signs demanding justice and reform, their faces a reminder of all those affected by corporate greed and negligence. As Lucia and Miguel emerged, the crowd parted. An older woman stepped forward, grasping Lucia's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Your forgiveness. It gives us all hope." Miguel looked up at his wife, his eyes shining with pride and love. In that moment, despite all they had endured, they knew they had made the right choice. Their act of forgiveness had set in motion a chain of events that could change countless lives. As they made their way down the courthouse steps, surrounded by a mix of supporters and media, Lucia and Miguel held their heads high. They had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, hope over despair, and in doing so, they had opened the door to a future where justice might take on a new, more transformative meaning. The Los Angeles sun shone brightly overhead, its warmth a promise of new beginnings. For Lucia, Miguel, Richard, and all those touched by their story, the journey was far from over. But with each step, they moved closer to a world where compassion and accountability could coexist, where one man's fall from grace could lead to a rising tide of positive change. As they drove away from the courthouse, Lucia looked back at the crowd still gathered on the steps. She thought of Richard, beginning his sentence, and of all the work yet to be done. A small smile played on her lips. This wasn't an ending, she realized. It was just the beginning.
Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you like the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.